There is something about Scotland that feels ancient even before you open a history book. The wind that cuts across the Highlands, the cliffs that face the North Atlantic, the islands scattered like broken stone across cold water. This is not just scenery, it is a genetic time capsule. When people say Scottish DNA is unique, they're not talking about magic or mythology, they're talking about geography, isolation, survival, and layer upon layer of human migration that's stacked over thousands of years like geological strata. Scotland did not simply inherit one ancestry. It absorbed waves of them, preserved some, diluted others, and in certain corners of the country, protected lineages that barely survived elsewhere in Europe. To understand why Scottish DNA stands out, you have to start with the Ice Age. Around 20,000 years ago, much of Scotland was buried under thick sheets of ice. No one lived there permanently. When the glaciers retreated roughly 12,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers began moving northward into newly opened land. These early settlers were part of the same broad population that repopulated much of Western Europe after the last glacial maximum. Their genetic signatures, often associated with Western hunter-gatherers, still echo faintly in modern Scots. But that was only the first layer. Then came the Neolithic Revolution. Around 6,000 years ago, farming communities spread into Britain from continental Europe. These were not simply local hunter-gatherers who decided to plant crops. Genetic evidence shows they were largely descended from early farmers whose ultimate origins trace back to Anatolia. They brought agriculture, monument-building traditions, and a new genetic profile. In Scotland, these early farmers left their mark in places like Orkney, where Neolithic structures such as Skara Brae still stand. Ancient DNA from these communities shows a strong continuity with the early European farmers, and in some regions of Scotland, especially the islands, their genetic imprint remained surprisingly intact for centuries. But the story does not stay simple for long. Around 400-500 years ago, another transformation occurred with the arrival of people associated with the Beaker culture. Genetically, these individuals carried substantial ancestry linked to steppe pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian region. Across Britain, this migration appears to have replaced a large proportion of the earlier Neolithic gene pool. Scotland was no exception. Ancient DNA studies suggest that within a few hundred years, much of the Neolithic genetic signature was dramatically reduced. The newcomers brought not just different pottery styles, but new lineages, including Y chromosome haplogroups like R1b, which are extremely common in Scotland today. This was one of the most profound demographic shifts in British prehistory. If that were the end of the story, Scottish DNA would not be particularly unique. It would simply mirror broader patterns seen across Britain and Western Europe. But Scotland's geography changed the trajectory. The Highlands, the Hebrides, Orkney and Shetland are not easy landscapes. Rugged terrain and stormy seas limited movement for the centuries. Communities became semi-isolated. Genetic drift, the random fluctuation of gene frequencies in small populations, began to shape local DNA in noticeable ways. In island populations especially, certain genetic variants became more common simply because the community was small and relatively closed. Then came the Iron Age and the emergence of groups we now label as Celtic. It is important to approach this carefully. Celtic is more a cultural and linguistic category than a clean genetic one. The people of Iron Age Scotland, often associated with the Picts in the north and Gaelic-speaking groups later on, were not genetically isolated from the rest of Britain. However, patterns in ancient DNA suggest regional continuity. In some parts of Scotland, particularly the north and west, there was less gene flow from southern Britain during certain periods. That relative insulation helped preserve distinct regional genetic signatures. The Vikings added another layer. From the late 8th century onward, Norse settlers established themselves in northern and western Scotland. Orkney and Shetland in particular experienced significant Scandinavian settlement. Genetic studies today show elevated levels of Norwegian ancestry in these regions compared to mainland Scotland. In Shetland, for example, a substantial proportion of Y chromosome lineages trace back to Norse origins. Yet even here, the Norse did not fully replace the local population. Instead, they mixed. The result was not a simple Scandinavian transplant, but a hybrid genetic profile shaped by both indigenous Scottish and incoming Norse ancestry. Meanwhile, mainland Scotland experienced its own complex dynamics. There were interactions with Anglo-Saxon populations from the south. Later, during the medieval and early modern periods, Trade, warfare, and political unions introduced further gene flow from England, Ireland, and continental Europe. However, these influences were uneven. The lowlands generally show more genetic similarity to northern England. The Highlands and Islands retain more distinct patterns. Even within Scotland, there is no single homogeneous genetic identity. Clan structures may have reinforced certain genetic patterns. Although romanticised today, clans were extended kinship networks. Marriage often occurred within limited geographic or social circles. In small Highland communities, repeated intermarriage over generations could amplify specific genetic traits. This does not mean clans were genetically pure or isolated from all outsiders. Social structures can influence how genes move or fail to move through a population. Modern genetic research has begun to map these patterns in detail. Large-scale studies analysing autosomal DNA, Y chromosome markers, and mitochondrial day reveal subtle but consistent clustering within Scotland. Individuals from the Hebrides, for example, can often be genetically distinguished from those in eastern Scotland. Orkney frequently forms its own cluster due to its strong Norse component and relative isolation. These differences are not dramatic in a global sense. A Scot is still genetically very similar to other northwestern Europeans, but at a fine scale the distinctions are measurable. There are also medical implications. Certain genetic conditions appear at higher frequencies in specific Scottish regions. This is partly due to founder effects. When a small group of ancestors carries a rare mutation and the population remains relatively isolated, that mutation can become more common over time. Researchers have identified regional patterns of inherited disorders that reflect historical population structures. This is not about superiority or inferiority, it is about demographic history written into DNA. It is tempting to treat Scottish DNA as something mystical, tied to kilts and battlefields, but the reality is more grounded and more fascinating. Uniqueness emerges not from being separate from humanity, but from being a crossroads that sometimes narrowed into a cul-de-sac. Scotland received waves of migrants, hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe-descended groups, Norse settlers. Yet its geography slowed, filtered and reshaped those waves. Over thousands of years, this produced a genetic landscape that is finely textured. Even today, when modern transportation has dissolved many barriers, echoes of that past remain detectable. Genetic clustering algorithms can often predict with surprising accuracy whether someone's grandparents came from the Hebrides, the northeast coast, or the borders. These are not rigid boundaries, but gradients, subtle shifts in allele frequencies that reflect centuries of marriage patterns, migrations, and isolation. At the same time, it is crucial to avoid exaggeration. Scottish DNA is not alien, nor is it radically divergent from neighbouring populations. The differences are statistical, not absolute. What makes it compelling is the clarity with which history aligns with genetics. Ice Age recolonisation, Neolithic farming expansions, Bronze Age replacements, Viking settlements, medieval social structures, each left a trace. Scotland functions almost like a living archive of European demographic history. In the end, the uniqueness of Scottish DNA is a story of layers and landscapes. It is about glaciers retreating and small bands of people stepping onto empty land. It is about stone circles rising under Neolithic skies, about Bronze Age migrations that reshaped entire gene pools. It is about longships cutting through cold seas toward island shores. It is about mountains that slowed armies and storms that discouraged casual travel. Above all, it is about continuity, families rooted in the same valleys and islands for generations, carrying fragments of ancient migrations within them. So when someone asks why Scottish DNA is so unique, the answer is not a single event or a single ancestry. It is the accumulation of time. It is isolation balanced with contact, replacement followed by survival, drift shaped by geography. It is Europe in miniature, compressed into a rugged northern edge of the continent where history did not just happen, it lingered, settled, and quietly inscribed itself into the genome.